Sophia stood frozen before the kitchen sink watching as droplets of water dripped steadily from the leaking pipe beneath, pooling into a shimmering puddle on the tiled floor. The faint glow of the overhead light reflected off the water, casting soft flickering patterns that seemed to echo the monotony of her life. The rhythmic ripping filled the quiet kitchen, an insistent reminder of something else in her life, something unseen that was slowly leaking away drop by drop. She exhaled deeply, her fingers brushing the cold and forgiving metal of the countertop, and her gaze drifted toward the clock. The second hand ticked relentlessly, a cruel reminder that time was slipping by. Yet here she stood, stuck in place. Ryan, as always, was away on a business trip. Evenings like this had become so commonplace that they no longer registered as unusual, but tonight, the solitude pressed down on her chest with a weight that was almost unbearable. A hollow loneliness she couldn't quite name. Glancing at the small puddle spreading on the floor, she reached for her phone, her fingers hesitating for a moment before dialing the number of her best friend, the one person she trusted to have an answer, even if it was sometimes overzealous. Liam Carter, Julie said confidently on the other end of the line. Call him. Trust me, you won't regret it. Her voice carried an assuredness that Sophia could only wish she felt. He's not just good at what he does. He's well. You'll see. Julie's playful tone earned a quiet laugh from Sophia, despite the tug of unease in her chest. I just need someone to fix the sink, she replied dryly, though the faintest a smile played at the corner of her lips. No more complications. Sure, sure, Julie quipped, her grin almost audible through the phone, and an hour later, the sharp rap of knuckles on the front door broke the quiet. Sophia pulled the door open, and her breath caught involuntarily. Standing before her was a man whose presence seemed to fill the doorway entirely. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. His dark brown eyes met hers directly, steadfast and calm, yet with a warmth that felt strangely disarming, as if he could see right through her. Miss Carlyle. His voice was deep, steady, and carried an authority that felt effortless. Yes, that's me, Sophia said, stepping aside to let him in. Her voice was steady, though her heart raced in an inexplicable way. Liam moved with the ease of someone accustomed to navigating new spaces, his tool bag swinging slightly as he crossed the threshold. Placing it on the floor with care, he offered a brief smile. Can you show me where the problem is? Sophia led him to the kitchen, where the puddle had grown slightly larger in her absence. Under the dim golden glow of the light, she could make out the deliberately composed set of his features. Nothing about him seemed hurried or uncertain. He crouched by the sink, his movements practiced and fluid as he assessed the damage, with his hands working with deft precision to loosen fittings and inspect the pipes. Sophia stood a few steps away, her arms folded, as though to guard against what exactly. Her gaze lingered, drawn to the quiet concentration etched on his face, the way his strong hands moved with purpose. There was something about him, a calm energy, a steady presence that seemed to command the space around him for reasons she couldn't explain. She found herself watching him longer than she should have, longer than she intended. That pipe is in bad shape, Liam said suddenly. His voice broke the silence, pulling her back to the moment. It's going to need a replacement, but I've got what I need in the truck. It'll take me a bit, but it should be good as new. Thank you. Sophia managed, her voice softer than she'd expected. But inside, a peculiar wave of tension began to rise. She turned away, hoping to steady herself, but the quiet rhythm of water droplets and the muffled sound of her own heartbeat filled the air. When Liam returned with the replacement part, the room seemed smaller somehow, as though his presence expanded to fill every corner. She could feel the faint hum of energy between them, unspoken and undeniable. And it unsettled her. He finished the job with the same calm efficiency, stood and turned to her. All done, he said, his gaze meeting hers once more. It shouldn't give you any more trouble, thank you, she said again, this time with a faint smile, but her gratitude felt inadequate. As though the words barely scratched the surface of what she was feeling, Liam lingered a moment longer than necessary, his eyes searching hers, as though looking for something unspoken. If there's anything else you need, he said, his tone measured. Just let me know. Sophia nodded, but her heart was already racing in the quiet hum of the kitchen, with the soft tap of rain against the window and the faintest echo of his words in her ears. She felt something stir deep within her, something that had lain dormant for far too long, something she didn't dare name. Sophia stood by the window, her gaze lost in the backyard garden, where the soft glow of the setting sun painted the trees in warm shades of amber. The world outside was serene, almost motionless, but inside her a storm raged. How long had it been since she last felt like herself? How long since she'd experienced joy in the marriage she had once dreamed of? The questions echoed in her mind like a mournful refrain. Relentless and unanswered, she closed her eyes and memories began to unfurl like an old film reel playing faded, grainy images. She remembered the first time she met Ryan at a lavish evening party downtown. He had been strikingly handsome, exuding the effortless confidence of a man who knew what he wanted. He made her feel special, as though she were the only woman in the room. The early days of their marriage had been blissful. Ryan had showered her with affection, from thoughtful little gifts to spontaneous getaways. She could still recall the way her heart raced when he looked at her with those tender, loving eyes. But life, as it turned out, was no fairy tale. As Ryan's business ventures took off, his time became consumed by work. The days he spent away grew longer, more frequent. And even when he was home, his mind seemed elsewhere, buried in projects and phone calls. Candlelit dinners turned into quiet meals alone, and the long evenings in bed became an unspoken ritual of scrolling through separate screens in silence. Sophia realized that the connection they once shared, the conversations, the laughter, the simple intimacy, had quietly slipped away. They still lived under the same roof, but they were like two parallel lines, destined never to intersect. She tried to talk to him, to reignite the spark that had once burned so brightly. But every effort was met with brief, dismissive responses, as if her words were an inconvenience. "I'm doing this for us," Ryan had said once, his tone clipped and impatient. But Sophia had begun to question if us even existed anymore. Slowly, she started to feel like a fixture in the house. Not a partner or a wife, but an object, always there, always overlooked. Sophia tried to ignore the growing emptiness, convincing herself that all marriages went through rough patches, that she simply needed to be more patient. Yet the void within her only deepened. Every morning she awoke in a beautiful, luxurious bedroom, but she felt like a stranger in her own life, adrift and disconnected. And now Liam had walked into this house, bringing with him an energy she hadn't felt in years. His presence was undeniable. His calm confidence, like a spark against the numbness she'd grown accustomed to in him. She saw something raw, something alive. And for the first time, she allowed herself to confront the painful truth. It wasn't just that she was lonely. She was yearning to live, to love, to feel a longing that Ryan, no matter how hard he tried, or how hard she wished, could no longer fulfill. When Liam bent down to inspect the sink, the dripping water became the only sound Sophia could hear in the quiet kitchen. She stood a few steps away, trying to maintain a safe distance, but her eyes had a mind of their own, instinctively drawn to where he crouched. His hands moved with practiced precision, strong and deliberate. The fabric of his shirt stretched slightly across his back with each movement, subtly revealing the quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from him. Sophia berated herself for noticing, but she couldn't stop. "This is pretty bad," Liam said, breaking the silence. His deep, steady voice seemed to ripple through the stillness. The pipes almost completely corroded. "Looks like the water's been leaking into the cabinet for a while." He glanced up at her with his dark brown eyes, meeting hers so suddenly that she felt momentarily exposed, as though he could see through her. "Would you like me to make sure? There might be more issues in the other areas that you haven't noticed yet." Sophia paused for a moment, her thoughts jumbled, and then she nodded automatically. She wasn't sure why she agreed. Maybe it was the calm assurance in his tone, or maybe she just didn't want him to leave too soon. "Sure, if it's not too much trouble," she said, her voice quieter than she'd intended. Liam smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held something deeper, something unspoken, not trouble at all. As he started looking at other areas of the kitchen, Sophia tried to concentrate on the cabinetry, the arrangement of items on the counter, and the small picture frame on the shelf. Then, Liam's hand brushed against it, and it fell to the floor with a sharp clatter, shattering the fragile silence. Both of them recoiled. To make sure the frame was undamaged, Liam knelt down and turned it in his hands. He said, "I'm sorry," in a tone that was almost apologetic. "I didn't mean to knock it over," he said, and as his eyes settled on the picture inside, his brow furrowed slightly. It was an old photo of Sophia and Ryan taken during their honeymoon in Paris, with Ryan's arms securely wrapped around her shoulders and both of them smiling radiantly. Liam's gaze lifted from the photo to meet hers, and for a brief moment, there was a glimmer of uncertainty in his eyes. "Your husband?" he asked in a neutral tone, but with a sensitivity that made Sophia feel as though he could see more than she wanted him to. Sophia nodded, a constriction forming in her throat. Yes, she replied softly, her voice almost breaking, that's him. Liam carefully returned the frame to its place, his movements more deliberate this time, but the way he looked at her afterward was different. It was no longer the casual curiosity of a stranger, nor the polite distance of a professional. There was something deeper, as though he were trying to decode the emotions she kept so tightly guarded. I guess he's pretty busy. Liam said his words almost casually, but Sophia could sense the undercurrent beneath them. Yes, she admitted. Her voice faint, weaker than she'd hoped. He's away a lot, his work is very important to him. Liam didn't respond immediately, but his eyes softened, a quiet understanding flickering within them. It wasn't pity, Sophia would have resented that, but an unspoken acknowledgement, as if he recognized her loneliness, as if he'd seen it before in someone else or perhaps in himself. For a moment, the space between them felt impossibly still, the soft hum of the leaking pipe, and the golden afternoon light streaming through the window faded into the background, leaving only the quiet tension that hung in the air. Are you okay? Liam asked suddenly, his voice low but steady. The simplicity of the question struck Sophia like a jolt breaking through the emotional walls she had spent so long fortifying. Her chest tightened, and her vision blurred slightly as tears threatened to surface. She turned her head away, unable to meet his gaze. I'm fine, she murmured. Though her voice trembled, betraying the truth, she couldn't bring herself to admit. Liam didn't push further. He simply stood there, his presence, calm yet unyielding, as though he could wait forever for her to feel safe enough to let her guard down. It was this quiet patience that unnerved her the most, that made her feel as though she could fall apart in front of him. And he wouldn't turn away. When Liam finally left, after a few more minutes of perfunctory checks, Sophia stood in the doorway and watched him walk to his truck, her heart pounding louder than it had in years. Back inside, the picture frame he had knocked over still sat on the shelf, undisturbed. But no longer the same to her. It no longer symbolized the happiness she once believed in. It had become a stark reminder of the emptiness she had grown accustomed to. Liam hadn't just repaired a leaking pipe, he had uncovered something inside her. Something she hadn't realized was still there. And in that moment, as she closed the door behind him, Sophia knew with a chilling certainty that everything had changed. The evening sky had darkened into deep shades of gray, and raindrops began to drum steadily against the rooftop. Sophia stood by the window, her eyes distant as they lingered on the garden outside. The golden hues of the late afternoon had given way to a bleak summer light mirroring the turmoil within her. It wasn't just the loneliness that always accompanied her. It was the intense disarray left behind by her encounters with Liam. He hadn't crossed any boundaries, yet his gaze, his quiet presence, and the way he truly listened, had left a mark on her. A lingering warmth she couldn't extinguish. The sudden knock on the door startled her, snapping her out of her thought. She wasn't expecting anyone. A flutter of anxiety bloomed in her chest as she walked toward the hallway, her breath catching slightly when she opened the door. Liam stood there, his shirt damp from the unexpected rain, his hair slightly tousled, his face calm, yet unmistakably strong. A faint, almost apologetic smile graced his lips. I'm sorry for dropping by unannounced, he said, his deep voice softer than the patter of rain outside. I was passing by and thought I should check on the sink. This rain might have made things worse. Sophia hesitated for only a second before stepping aside, quietly opening the door wider to let him in. It's fine, she replied, her voice steady, though her heart felt like it might betray her. Honestly, I haven't checked it since the last time you were here. Liam removed his rain-soaked jacket and hung it neatly on a hook by the door, revealing the dark-fitted t-shirt beneath. Sophia averted her gaze quickly, but the weight of his presence seemed to fill the small space entirely. He moved to the kitchen, where the sound of the rain against the windows amplified the stillness between them. As he crouched down to check the pipes, Sophia lingered a few steps away, the air around her growing heavier with each passing second. Everything seems fine, Liam said after a few moments, standing up and turning to face her. But instead of stepping back, he remained where he was, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity she hadn't seen before. Sophia, he said softly, her name slipping from his lips for the first time, and it felt like a doorway opening, an invitation she couldn't ignore. She wasn't sure how she ended up so close to him. It could have been her own steps, or the magnetic pull of his presence in the space between them dissolved, and when she found herself standing mere inches from him, her breath grew shallow and uneven. Liam held her gaze as if searching for some unspoken permission. "Are you sure you're okay?" And their lips met, not tentative or hesitant, but with the intensity of a storm. The kiss was all-consuming, unraveling every wall she had constructed to shield herself from the truth. His hands cued her face gently while her fingers clung to his shirt, desperate and trembling, as though letting go would shatter the moment entirely. Time seemed to stop. Right and wrong, reason and consequence, all dissolved into the charged stillness between them. But the sharp ring of her phone shattered the spell, yanking them both back to reality. They broke apart abruptly. Their breathing was ragged. Asked his voice, gentle but laden with meaning that neither of them could deny. Sophia couldn't answer. Words felt impossible, unnecessary. Instead, she found herself taking a final step closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, and then, as if swept away by an irresistible force, she tilted her face up, her eyes locking with his, and the dam of restraint she had carefully built for so long finally broke. Liam leaned in. Sophia turned toward the sound, her heart racing as she saw the name on the screen. Ryan. Her throat tightened as she picked up the phone, her fingers trembling. "I'm home earlier than I thought." Ryan's familiar voice rumbled through the line. Calm yet certain. "I'm about 10 minutes away." The words hit her like a blow. She turned back to Liam, who stood frozen, his expression shifting to one of quiet understanding tinged with worry. The world seemed to grind to a halt between them, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them like the rain outside. Reality, unrelenting and merciless, had come crashing in. "You have to go," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Liam nodded without hesitation, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. He didn't speak, but just before stepping out, he turned back to look at her. His gaze was steady yet filled with something unresolved, something unsaid. Then he was gone, disappearing into the rain-soaked night. Sophia stood motionless before the door he had just closed, her heart pounding in her chest like a drumbeat of impending doom. 10 minutes. That was all she had before Ryan walked through that same door, before she would have to face him, face herself, and face the undeniable truth. She had crossed a line that could never be erased. The rain outside had become a faint hum, blending into the background noise of Sophia's turbulent thoughts. She stood at the bathroom sink, her hands gripping its edges, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her heart pounded fiercely in her chest, drowning out everything else. She raised her eyes to the mirror, locking onto her reflection, a face once bright with joy, now shadowed by confusion and guilt. The sound of Ryan's car pulling into the driveway jolted her back to reality. The front door opened, and Ryan entered in his gray suit, immaculate despite the rainy weather. His face was composed, his usual air of composure intact, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "I'm home," he said in a deep, familiar voice that was comforting even as he walked toward her, setting his briefcase on the table before wrapping his arms around her waist. The warmth of his embrace was almost suffocating, and Sophia stiffened instinctively. "Is something wrong, Ryan?" she wondered. As he walked toward the kitchen, Sophia felt her legs weaken beneath her. The room seemed to spin slightly under the weight of everything pressing down on her. "Face it, you don't look well." "It's nothing," he asked, pulling back slightly to study her. "I'm just tired," Sophia replied quickly, forcing a weak smile. Ryan watched her for a moment longer before nodding. "You should rest. Let me get you some water." Might he detect it? Everything seemed so flimsy, like if one mistake might ruin the frail facade she was putting on. Ryan's voice came from the kitchen, shattering her whirling thoughts and causing her heart to stop. "Sophia, who fixed it?" Her voice had to be firm as she rushed into the kitchen. Ryan nodded absently, as if his attention was elsewhere, as he reached into the cabinet for a glass. However, as he opened it, something small and crumpled fell to the floor, and he bent to pick it up, smoothing the paper in his hand. His tone was sharp as he turned to face her, and his gaze bore into her, piercing and unrelenting. "Liam Carter, who is this?" Sophia. Her blood ran cold as she stared at the slip of paper in his hands. Liam's name and number were written in a scroll, which she instantly recognized. She had completely forgotten about it, and had no idea how it got there. Ryan took a slow, deliberate step toward her, the tension in the room growing with each inch he closed between them. "You're not hiding anything from me," he said, his voice low and steady. "Are you her?" She briefly considered confessing everything, including the kiss and the intense loneliness that had driven her to the brink. But she couldn't bring herself to do so after meeting Ryan's eyes, which were full of suspicion but also a hint of love. She knew that if she told the truth, nothing would ever be the same. Ryan didn't respond right away. His eyes lingered on her, searching, questioning for what seemed like an eternity before turning away and walking to the refrigerator, pouring himself a glass of water. He drank deeply, as if the ACT might wash away whatever thoughts were churning in his mind. Sophia said, shakily. "There's nothing," she whispered, forcing a tight smile. "He's just a handyman, nothing more." Before she could react, Ryan picked up her phone, and she noticed the instantaneous change in his expression as his eyes flicked from the screen to her. She knew it was the message from Liam. 3 simple yet damning words. Her chest tightened with a mixture of relief and dread. "I miss you." The kitchen fell silent, and Ryan's hand gripped the phone tightly before placing it carefully on the counter. His fists were clenched at his sides, and his voice was barely audible above a whisper. Sophia was unable to move or speak at that moment, realizing that every decision she had made, every step she had taken, the kiss, the rain, the lies, the guilt, everything had brought her to this breaking point. Ryan turned and picked up his briefcase as he made his way to the door. "We need to talk, but not right now." The door closed behind him with a heavy finality, leaving Sophia alone in the stifling silence of the house. She sank into a chair and stared at the phone on the counter, Liam's message still glowing on the screen. The rain outside had increased, but it hardly noticed that she had crossed a line. Now, all she could do was wait for the consequences to catch up with her, and in the oppressive silence, one question kept coming to her mind. Have I just lost everything, or have I finally found myself?